Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another Digimon video. So today I'm going to be doing another topical video. This time, yes, it is going to be a little bit more on the negative and pessimistic side because we are going to be talking about bans and restrictions. And while Bandai did just give us a ban and restriction update, to try to help fix the current state of the game, I personally don't think that was enough to actually fix the current state of the game, and I'm not very happy with where the game has developed as a result. So I decided to take a look at where the meta currently is and formulate a list of my own of cards that I think should be banned and or limited. But before we get into bans and restrictions, it isn't uncommon for Bandai to try to, repeat what they've done in the past, and in the past they have done some unrestrictions. So while I personally don't believe in unrestrictions, I think based on the current state of the game, there are a couple of cards that could come off the ban and restriction list, just, based on what we're actually playing with and how we're actually playing the game. Yes, I do understand that the majority of the cards that are going onto the ban and restriction list are high power, and that's partially why I don't think they should come back, but because the game is already at such an egregious state, what's actually the harm in certain cards coming back? But now getting into the actual bans and restrictions, there are a couple of things that I want to highlight before we actually get into the list. So these are my own personal opinions, and I am going to try to utilize Bandai's language when talking about these bans and restrictions because, they've already gave a lot of reasons on why cards should get limited, and not all the cards on this list actually do need to get banned or limited, especially all at once. Some are more conditional than others due to the nature of card games and certain cards being problematic in combination with one another or just because another type of card exists. I do also think that Bandai actually needs to start banning cards, but I'm not going to be talking about what cards actually need to get banned. This is just cards that I think should get hit, and Bandai also could start thinking about errataing some cards to try to make them more fair because, leaving certain cards a little bit too open-ended has proven to be problematic in the past and is continuing to prove to be problematic now. So what are the usual reasons why cards get limited to begin with? We do have patterns that we could kind of look into and follow based on what Bandai has done in the past and their reasonings on why specific cards get hit. So the main reasons why cards get hit could really be broken down into 5 main reasons. The first one is going to be it increases the speed of the deck. The second one is going to be high board retention. The third one is going to be effective for too long, or it just eats up design space, so they need to hit it to free up that design space. The fourth one is going to be unintended interactions, and the fifth one is going to be unenjoyable play patterns. But now we get to take a look at where the current meta is and kind of start formulating what should get hit and why. So what does the meta currently look like? Right now for the EX7 environment, these are our current top 8 decks in no particular order. We have Imperialdramon, Ancient Garurumon, 7 Great Demon Lords, Leviamon, Mirage, Fenrilugamon, Mother Control, and Dexter Goramon. But that doesn't mean there's still some decks that aren't able to top. These are just the decks that are topping more consistently than everything else in the entire meta, which isn't necessarily uncommon. And some of the more off-meta decks, these are kind of just, I guess, the tier 2 decks, would be Yellow Vaccines, more specifically the Armor variant, Magnamon X, and Omnimon Ace. So taking a look at what these decks are doing more specifically, if anyone actually isn't familiar with where the current state of the meta is, these are basically the only decks that are actually viable. Sure, you do get the rogue one-off deck that does top, but that's been less frequent in this format compared to other formats, which is actually a problem. It could just be people are just playing these 11 decks more often than the rogue decks, but that's not always the case, and it doesn't necessarily seem like that's the case for this environment. It's just these decks are fundamentally stronger than everything else in the entire game, limiting what's even playable, especially when it comes to matchup breakdowns. So this format, in basic layman's terms, could just be described as either be blue or beat blue. And you could kind of see in their overall color representation if you understand what these decks are and what they're doing. And we could try to take and hit some of these decks to try to bring the game more in line with what it reasonably should be. So with all that said and done, let's just dive into the list of cards that I personally would like to see banned and or limited. Starting things off with XVmon from BT12 and Stingmon from BT12. So I am going to preface this with a big spoiler alert in terms of the rest of the cards on this list. A lot of them are going to have to do with the fact that they allow you to cheat on the resource system of the game, which is memory. So what are these cards doing more specifically that's allowing us to cheat on memory as much as possible? Well, that's because they print memory when you're going to be using them for their respective DNA digivolutions. So obviously with Imperialdramon being a blue and a green deck, you're going to DNA digivolve into a level 5 blue and green Digimon, which means utilizing both of these cards, you're going to be generating 2 free memory for doing so, and that 2 free memory is actually going to go towards a lot on helping the deck excel faster and potentially do more than what it reasonably should be doing. So these cards weren't necessarily a problem when they first were printed because we had a little bit of a harder time with the setups to actually make these memory generating effects even more useful. But now with BT16, thanks to the duo tamer Davis and Ken, it allows us to make utilizing these cards that much easier. And as we've seen with some of the past bans and restrictions, when you're getting up into your level 5 for a total of 1 memory, that's usually highly problematic. And that's exactly what this deck is doing, because as early as turn 2, you could get into a level 5 that's potentially multi-swinging and shutting the opponent out of the game with some possible protections, making it very hard to even interact with. So the idea is you're going to hold 1 rookie in your raising area, you're going to set up the Davis and Ken tamer from BT16, and then as early as next turn, you move that rookie out, use the tamer to play a free rookie, and then you only need to spend up to 4 memory, because depending on what the Wormmon and what the Vmon are doing, they could possibly reduce the cost of digivolving into these cards, which just makes the deck even more efficient to use, even utilizing specific rookies. So this is really powerful because even if you do pass over the memory, it's not going to be passing over the memory by a lot, because your expenditure when it comes to the memory you're using is almost equal to what you're going to be gaining off of these effects and off of the tamer. So the idea is with that type of a setup, you're going to digivolve into Stingmon and XVmon. Then you could use the end of turn DNA effect if you did pass turn to be able to gain basically almost all the memory that you spent, maintaining your turn, allowing you to do potentially more to further disrupt the opponent or further aggress on the opponent. So the fact that with Partition, these cards also could be played for free, and if it's still your turn or the opponent isn't able to deal with the residual bodies, then you just can DNA up for free and then start your turn with that DNA and gain memory for doing that, and that's going to put you that much more ahead on being able to formulate counterplays for what the opponent is doing, on top of all of the different tools that the deck has to work with. It all comes down to the fact that these 2 cards are generating you memory, and that's why Imperialdramon is currently one of the best decks in the game. And if those 2 cards aren't hit, then I at least would like to see Davis and Ken hit, because this is, well, one of the key cards that's enabling the deck to begin with to be as efficient as it is. It's the card that's setting up your Wormmon or Vmons, and it's not even specifically just for Imperialdramon, because other decks like to use this tamer just because of the names of those rookies that they could play is not color locked, so other decks could be utilizing other other Wormmons or Vmons to do various different things when it comes to their overall setup and efficiency. Then the tamer effect, being able to gain a memory when we digivolve, means that even if we're not going to be using the DNA digivolution right away, we could still use this to make our cards that much more efficient, which is, again, in line part of the problem with what Imperialdramon is doing is when it's firing on all cylinders, it is one of the most efficient decks in the game, spending almost nothing to be able to get up into the level 5, which is going to usually try to shut down and shut out the opponent, and if the level 5 doesn't do it, then you could easily use it to go into your level 6 to accomplish the same thing. And as far as other things that are helping enable get up into your high level Digimon as quickly as possible, this is kind of why I also want to see the EX5, Koh and Sayo get hit in some capacity. So while this card seems pretty fine on base, it's actually more egregiously powerful than people give it credit for, because it only states that you need to start in a Light Fang or Nightclaw traded Digimon, but you don't need to actually end in a Light Fang or Nightclaw traded Digimon. So the idea on how this card is used is, well, obviously you're going to start with the archetype it's stating, then you're going to basically put that level as the bottom Digivolution source, and then use this type of effect to digivolve for free into whatever other Digimon you want, and that inline is part of the problem because, well, that Digimon could be anything, and half the time when you're using this card in combination with the other Light Fang and Nightclaw cards, you're either going to be trying to gain memory or reduce the cost of your Digivolutions even further, so that way you could use this card in combination with those low-end cards to digivolve basically for a net cost of like 1 or nothing, all the way up into your level 5 Digimon that you then can digivolve into a level 6 Digimon pretty easily and efficiently, because sometimes you also could gain memory when you're going to be utilizing that engine and package. It really just depends on how the plays line out, but the fact that it's easily enabling you to go up into high level Digimon, on top of the fact that it's not specifically trait locked for the Digimon you're digivolving into, to be able to propel its gameplay even further, and that unfortunately is going to start reducing overall deck diversity and variety, similarly to Jet Sylphimon from BT7, because what they stated with Jet Sylphimon on its banning and limitation was it was reducing the field in which yellow is played, and this is kind of doing the same thing for red and blue, more specifically blue. And part of that is in line with some of the other cards that it's generally playing with, like the BT16 Gaugamon, as another card that I would like to see get hit in some capacity. So this card is not only just strong with the Light Fang and Nightclaw package, but it's also just a really good generic level 4 Digimon in of itself. So it has two conditions it wants to try to meet in order to gain that one memory. Both conditions are actually not that difficult to achieve if you really think about it. But gaining the memory with an evo cost of 2 means that it's really only evoing for 1, which doesn't necessarily seem like it's a problem. It only starts to become problematic when we have ways to be able to digivolve into this Digimon for free, because now that +1 memory is actually going to be gaining us memory for digivolving, which usually we should be spending some memory when we're going to be doing that type of action. So between the free evolutions into this card on top of the memory generation that it's providing, that's just allowing decks utilizing that style of play to excel further and faster than most other decks in the game, because most other decks you actually have to pay for things. Then when it comes to the inheritable ability, that's just the icing on the cake, having generic jamming, which just allows you to use whatever other cards you want to make those higher stage Digimon that much more aggressive. And Blue has been getting a string of really strong and powerful generic Digimon that a lot of Blue decks are currently abusing, and one such card is EX5 Hankunmon. So Hankunmon kinda is very similar to what EX4 Mach Gaugamon was doing, and if you're unfamiliar with what that card was doing because it got limited to 1, the inheritable ability allowing any higher stage Digimon to multi-attack was really pretty good, especially on an easy to fulfill condition, and this is kind of on that same vein, where it's allowing us to be able to multi-attack as long as we have another blue Digimon in play to be able to throw underneath this card, which this card is also setting up itself because it's on play and when Digivolving ability allows us to split out those sources. So that's kind of going into the ease of use on being able to multi-attack. Sure, it's not technically as efficient as what EX4 Magnamon is doing, but it's still really powerful because of all of the additional levels of combo play this has because of what you could do with that extra body it's spitting out and the types of cards that you're going to be putting into your inheritable sources thanks to both of these abilities. And we can't talk about blue generically good cards without taking a look at BT11 Mirage Gaugamon. So at this point, this card probably has overstayed its welcome with how efficient this card actually is due to the combination of its own abilities. So what this card is doing more specifically that's making it so good is the All Turns ability that's de-incentivizing the opponent from adding cards to their hand. So if they're trying to dig and search and try to find their answers, this card is essentially going to be taxing them for doing that, which isn't necessarily a problem. The problem is the fact that it's on all turns, which means it can trigger on your turn when you're going to be using this card to make itself and various other cards that much more efficient to use, and that's the underlying issue with this card, because as we've seen with BT16 Gaugamon, the fact that we have alternative ways to be able to reduce its Digivolution, and the fact that if the opponent does have enough cards in their hand, then this card basically makes himself free to use, is part of the issue. It's just being the most efficient level 6 in the entire game, or if not the entire game, at least in the color of blue. Because when Digivolving ability already triggers the All Turns effect during your turn when you're going to be using this card, because he's either bouncing an opponent's level 5 or lower Digimon back into their hand, which is already pretty decent because Bounce is one of the strongest forms of removal right now because it doesn't trigger on delete abilities, and there's certain other levels of protection that bouncing can also get around. Then the other ability is if no Digimon was actually bounced, then you're still adding a card to their opponent's hand because, well, you're taking it out of their security, which means you're effectively dealing it damage. So it puts the opponent in a lose-lose situation while going up into one of the cheapest level 6 Digimon in the entire game. And if you want to talk about another card that's helping ignore the fundamental resource system of the game to make going into high-level Digimon and using high-level Digimon cost basically nothing, we have to talk about BT14 Baumon. So Baumon, there's two major factors going into this card on why it's broken. The first one, which is its own ability, is not limited to once per turn, which doesn't necessarily seem that bad because you still have to pay for the Digivolutions that you're using its ability with. But the second problem starts kicking in when you have BT17 Takamikazuchi as a card, because he basically invalidates the cost of every single Digivolution that you're going to be doing because of Baumon. So Takamikazuchi basically allows you to snap the memory back onto your side when you DNA Digivolve with that Digimon, which you're going to be creating this long evolutionary chain because of how Baumon works to go all the way up into Takamikazuchi and maintain turn on a really powerful level 7 that's most likely going to be set up and designed to OTK the opponent, not only invalidating the resource system, but also trying to be as uninteractive as possible, mostly thanks to those two cards. But if you want to at least try to have a semblance of the deck remain intact, you kind of have to leave Takamikazuchi alone, even though that's clearly the problem card. The other problem card comes from Baumon, which is why this one should at least get limited in comparison to both if you were trying to actually keep decks somewhat intact. Now, the next card on the list is another tempo tool for more specifically X-Antibody-based decks. And what I mean by X-Antibody-based decks is just any deck that has X-Antibody traded Digimon. X-Antibody Digimon are already some of the strongest Digimon in the game. Granted, that comes from a lore perspective that then is translated into the game, but that doesn't stop the fact that a card like EX5 X-Antibody Protoform is absolutely insane. So, we already have high levels of consistency when it comes to being able to draw lots of cards, which is partially why Hammer Spark got limited and partially why this card should also get limited, because it's only accelerating X Antibody decks even further, because similar to Hammer Spark, it's helping you reduce the cost of your Digivolutions by 1. Granted, Hammer Spark is just a generic gain 1 memory, but the fact that Protoform is still a zero cost option that essentially nets you a memory is still really powerful, especially since it's letting you go into your X Antibody traded Digimon, which there's a good portion of and there's only an increasing amount of, and the fact that a lot of the better X Antibody Digimon want either the base form or the X Antibody option in its inheritables makes this a prime target to be used and abused by a wide variety of different decks. And speaking of being able to be used in a wide variety of different decks, next I'm suggesting is going to be EX1 Analog Youth. So Analog Youth is one of the cheapest searching or digging tools in the game, being hyper efficient, having a really low play cost. Being able to dig 3 is already pretty decent, especially for any Digimon, but the fact that the rest of the cards go into the trash actually makes this one of the better searchers in the entire game, because, well, the trash for a lot of colors is basically like a secondary zone that they could start pulling cards from, or they just want cards in there in general. So those types of colors are mostly purple, red, and black. But that doesn't mean that others can't abuse the secondary part of its effect, especially in combination with abilities that want to delete themselves. So that way you could try to do this soft loop where you use your Digimon, it gets deleted, and then you reset in the raising area, and you can keep up the pressure every single turn, and the memory gain also could be used in certain combo situations to be able to make your cards that much more efficient than they reasonably should be. I get that the intended design purpose was to be more of a catch-up mechanic, but because of the current state of the game, that's not necessarily how the card is actually being used, and it's being used more of a combo piece rather than a catch-up mechanic. And speaking of problems with Digimon, I'm also going to be suggesting Starter Deck 17, Rapidmon. This isn't necessarily because it's tempo efficient. In fact, most of the time we're using this card, it's not super tempo efficient outside of small situations because of its on-play and when digivolving ability to de-digivolve could just be enough of an anti-tempo move against the opponent to really put them on the back foot. But the primary reason why I'm suggesting this card is mostly because of the protections it's offering being so hard to deal with that a lot of decks just literally can't get rid of this card, and this card can lead to a whole bunch of other problematic cards being in green and black, so that way it's one of the best primary ace targets and just one of the best primary green or black generic tools that they could actually use. The inheritable ability is just the icing on the cake in case you're trying to be offensive or defensive, making it better than most other cards in its class. And speaking of being better than most cards in its class, next we have BT16, Magnamon X Antibody. So Magnamon X Antibody is borderline a mistake. This card is game warping because of its overall presence. So what's making this card so good isn't necessarily just the blocker and armor purge, it's more so its when digivolving ability that its all turns effect feeds back into, so that way you could always get its when digivolving ability over and over again, adding lots of protection to your deck and making it very hard for the opponent to actually deal with this card, creating very few opportunities to actually out this card, which makes it very hard to get rid of, and thus, because a lot of decks can't actually get rid of it, most decks just lose to this card in of itself without really any other things going on, and that is problematic because now if this is basically the floor, the rest of the game is going to be warped around how it could interact with this card, or the decks that actually could interact with this card, but those are far and few between, which then presents the persisting problem of, can new cards reasonably be able to deal with this card? If the answer is yes, then it's somewhat playable. If the answer is no, then it's unplayable, and that's not good from a sales perspective, on top of the fact that just being unable to do anything about this card for a wide variety of decks just creates lots of feels bad situations, making the game less healthy overall because of this style of card's existence. And then the next card on the list is going to be EX4 ShineGreymon Ruin Mode. So this is just another card that for a lot of decks is just really hard to deal with and creates very unfun situations because of its when digivolving and on delete ability to just give the opponent's field a blanket minus 5k DP, which there's a lot of things that fit within inside of that threshold that basically locks them out from even being able to play the game for a couple of turns, forcing them to essentially do nothing, and doing nothing isn't really fun in my perspective, and the fact that this card is loopable and reusable, and the effect also could be stacked and exacerbated, only makes this type of a card worse, being one of the most oppressive control tools in the entire game. And then there are a couple of choice restrictions I also wouldn't mind seeing. So Shoto Kazuma is going to be the big one from EX7, mostly with clock style decks. If you're unfamiliar with what a clock style deck is, basically it's a telegraphed secondary resource system that the deck is building up towards it, and then it's going to use to be able to try to defeat the opponent with basically an alternative win condition, except it's not really an alternative win condition. That's just how this deck kind of just wins. So the three clock style decks that we currently have in the game are Mother D Reaper, Gate of Deadly Sins, and King Drazel 76. So I think Shoto Kazuma with all three of these decks is incredibly unhealthy, because the idea of these decks is you're going to be playing a body every single turn to then have that be converted into a resource, and at least in King Drazel and Gate of Deadly Sins' case, it's going to be actively reducing the cost of your big bodies. So if you pair that up with Shoto, that means you have really cheap big bodies that also just so happen to be able to block, increasing the overall efficiency at being able to stall out the game so that they could reach their inevitable win condition that much more effectively. In the case of Mother D Reaper, even though most D Reapers aren't exactly super big bodies, Mother is a big body, and Mother also is an uninteractable body, similar to Magnamon X Antibody, where there's very limited abilities and interactions that you could use to be able to out this card, and I think that in of itself is just a huge problem, and that's why Shoto should be limited for at least these clock style decks. I think for not clock style decks, that's a little bit better, but it's still not great considering how generic Shoto is. And if they're not going to be willing to choice restrict Shoto, they should at least be willing to hit the card in some capacity. And then the other choice restriction I would like to see is basically just more cards added to the list that Saya and Koh is being restricted with. I think this card is just getting to the point where it is probably just so problematic it should just be limited to one or just banned or whatever, but I think that for its deck to try to keep it alive, this is a little bit more important than the other tamer because of how it tries to get into Grace Novamon, so you kind of do have to at least try to keep it around, but the fact that it still has cards that interact with it to basically make a loop to end the opponent's turn before it even begins is still very problematic, so more cards needed to be added to the list to be able to make the card a little bit more fair. And this is where things start to get a little bit nuclear in terms of the cards that I want to see Bandai ban and limit in some capacity. And what I mean by nuclear is more of the fact that it's just actually a batch of cards centered around a specific design aspect. So to kind of show off what I mean by this, I'm going to start with one of the more controversial picks, and that's going to be the training cards. So each color does have a specific training card associated to them, and I find all of them to be highly problematic at only increasing the overall speed and tempo of the game to an unhealthy level, while also warping the foundation of the game as a whole. So Bandai usually likes to try to create these staple type cards to be able to fix a particular design flaw or aspect of the game, but with training cards, they kind of already did, and they just wanted to do the same thing but better, which is not actually good for the game as a whole because we already had the problem solved. So these aren't actually solving any problems. And because of the fact that training cards exist alongside of memory boosts is warping a lot of deck design based around those two types of cards, because why bother playing anything for the opponent to interact with when I could just use training card after memory boost after training card after memory boost to dig out everything that I need and then move my one Digimon out of raising and kind of use all of my training and memory boosts that I banked to be able to make a huge explosive turn to probably win the game with on the spot. And that's inline really problematic, especially with how high-powered the game is. And even if you're not using the training cards in this particular manner, just the fact that they are banked to the full refund compared to the more fairly statted memory boost type cards is another huge problem, especially since the fact that we do have lots of cards on level 3, 4, and 5, and even some level 6s that like to gain memory. So now you're using these cards to effectively gain resources that you reasonably shouldn't have had to begin with. And we've already seen this kind of warp the game as a whole, as decks that don't have access to training cards kind of start falling by the wayside unless they already have a built-in mechanism to be able to keep up with the overall speed of them, or they just have so much protection they just don't actually care about what the game is doing as a whole. So that's kind of like the problem on where training cards start kicking in and taking place, and why I don't necessarily think they're healthy for the game. Then the other big aspect that I kind of want to see gutted from the game is, well, there's just a lot of highly problematic rookies that have too easy abilities to generate memory. So we've seen rookies that generate memory before, especially on the inheritable side of things, but the big difference between some of those that we had in the past is usually they required some interaction between you and the opponent. So the opponent can then try to play around it, and then you don't get the benefit of that ability. But we do have a handful of rookies that just have abilities to easily gain that memory to make your plays that much more efficient without any input from the opponent. And you combine that on top of all of the extra resource generation that training cards have, and you could start to see where things are accelerating to a problematic state in terms of how quickly decks are able to move. And it's not like these are the only types of cards in this category. There's just a lot of really powerful rookies in general that are able to generate memory, both as a native ability and as an inheritable ability. And we also can extend this to level 4s and potentially level 5s and 6s as well, because of the existence of certain cards on being able to generate you that free resource or reduce your evolutions to make your cards that much more effective, basically ignoring the resource system of the game. So, like I kind of alluded to, it's not exactly exclusively on a level 3 issue. It's just the lower the level you generally go and the more abilities you have of being able to gain that memory, the more problematic things are going to be getting, because if your inheritables are doing nothing but gaining you memory, then you're not really spending any memory, or what you're spending isn't going to be as much as what the game is actually expecting you to spend. And that's kind of where things are breaking, is just a lot of things are fundamentally ignoring the base resource system of the game, and that is in part of the problem. You could refer back to all of the top decks in the game, and the vast majority of them are cheating on the resource system in a fundamental way, moving faster than almost every other deck in the game. And if they're not, the inverse is kind of true, where they're just going to be so powerful on what their cards are doing or the level of protection that they have that it functionally doesn't matter how much much memory you're spending because the opponent isn't able to interact and out your cards. So you could kind of see this like weird pattern in terms of what decks are actually doing well based on them trying to cheat on the resource system as much as possible. And I get that's just part of power creep, and I get that's just part of playing some of the better decks is making your cards as efficient as possible, but it's to such an unhealthy level that we're not actually utilizing the resource system of the game, which is one of the biggest draws and appeals to it compared to every other game on the market. And there were a couple of other cards that I was thinking about adding to this list because I still find them to be highly problematic in various different ways, but I felt like those issues that I'm highlighting are more problematic than the ones on my personal watch list. But I hope Bandai is able to look at the data and infer the same type of stuff that I'm able to infer, so that way, come the next ban and restriction list, whenever that is, they can actually start trying to fix the game more than they did in the last one. But that's all I really have for this video. Feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below in terms of any cards that you would like to see banned or limited, and if you agree or disagree with what I'm personally wanting. And if you found this video to be enjoyable and informative, make sure while you're down there, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so you know when I go live and upload next. And I hope to see everyone in the next video.